It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Andrew Newman, who obviously is not a stranger for the people gathered at this conference. He holds the personal chair of Islamic Studies and Persian at the University of Edinburgh, and as we all know, has spent his academic career investigating the intellectual history of Shiism in particular. He worked on the formation of early Shi Hadith scholarship and the kind of scholarly milieus in which it occurred. And he's done extensive research and published widely on the Safavid periods in Iranian history, in particular the intellectual history of the Safavid periods, looking at different articulations, contestations of Shia religiosity in the Safavid Empire. And I'm extremely pleased having him speaking, but also the choice of the title, because I think it provides a very appropriate introduction to the conference, sort of spanning the arc from the pre-modern history of Shiism to its reception, the memory that is created of this within modern Shi thought. So his paper is entitled Back to the Future, Idealizing Safavid Period Clergy-State Relations Between East and West. And just to remind you, the keynote will be recorded, but we'll stop the recording after it's finished. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me thank you for all that wonderful praise. Let me say I was looking forward to go to Berlin, but you guys have managed terrifically. And so many congratulations to you, Oliver, and your team for transferring all of this online. So well done. Looks terrific. And thank you for all the fine words without my even having done anything. So that's even better. So I hope I don't disappoint. After all those fine words, I'm absolutely appalling at tech. And as I was saying to Douglas, your tech guy, if our 27-year-old was here, I'd be home free, but she's not. So I'm going to now try and share my screen with the PowerPoint that worked a few minutes ago. And there we go. If it works, I'd be mighty surprised. Getting more and more surprised. There we go. Oh, and all the pictures are there. Terrific. Okay. Well, again, let me formally thank Oliver and his team for all the hard work they've put into this gathering. Checking my emails, I saw the event was actually supposed to have taken place in Berlin in September of last year, as one of several events organized under the auspices of the Alterumma project located in Birmingham here in the UK. So well done and putting this together. The overall topic and the take on it that I'm going to be offering gives me a chance to address several stages of my own research in Safavids and Shiism, Safavid and not, and reflections thereon that have occupied me in the past couple of years. You'll forgive me if I don't actually look at the camera because my presentation is down here on the left. There'll certainly be of importance some coming projects, though doubtless by such events and interactions of this, they're going to undergo some major and minor alterations and adjustments along the way. Maybe we'll be up by the autumn, but I'm not really 100% sure. This particular paper is one of these teaching-led research categories that the university, I don't know about your universities where everybody has been across the world, they really love this stuff, the interaction between teaching and research. And I teach a course on Iran, whose students, many of whose students don't have any ability in Persian or Arabic. And this paper is going to talk a lot about Ali Shariati. And one of the important things about Shariati is he's not only one of Iran's most prominent pre-revolutionary figures, but also a lot of his stuff is available in English. And there's also a lot of stuff about him in the secondary sources. And so this allows me to offer a session on him and his career, on his contributions. And a key element of his discourse involves this thing called what he called Safavid Shiism. So I could use his short translated essay on Red Shiism and Black Shiism as a kind of an introduction to the topic. Mainly, this particular essay covers the former, the revolutionary Imam Hussein Karbala sort of Shiism, which he argues is fundamentally and forever comprised and tamed by the Safavids association with the faith over the 2 centuries after Ismail I's capture of Tabriz in 1501. That essay ends on this note, but it doesn't unpack the latter, the Safavid Shiism. Only his 1972/73 AlaviShiism and Safavid Shiism, to my knowledge, not available in English, does that. So for this paper, I looked at that one. And so what I'm going to cover here, as you see on the screen, is a brief background on Shariati, a look at these essays, the second in more detail, a discussion of the Western academic agenda on this. By that, I mean the West, both pre and post 79. I'm going to examine very briefly the different kinds of agendas that I feel are at work. Look at this to look at the relevance to the question of clergy-state relations, both then, but also now, and then suggest that there's another way or other kinds of ways that many of us have already latched onto in the field, in Middle Eastern studies general, but also in Iranian and Safavid period history. And that is looking at society, turning the social intellectual pyramid, as it were, upside down and trying to figure out what's going on the ground. And at the heart of that, I want to reprise my work on anti-clerical sentiment at the end of 17th century Sufi antinomianism, which I'm joyful I can say at this hour of the morning with only a little bit of coffee, and then offer a brief summary and conclusion. There we go. Next slide. Let's try this one here. Oh, nope. There we go. A bit on Shariati. I'm not going to belabor this. Ali Rahnamah's book, 1998, is pretty good on this, and there's a lot of other secondary source material on the basic biographical material. You can see from this that he spent a lot of time in France, and he got arrested a lot. He was very interested in the global South, and one of the things that he was involved in was the translation of Fanon's work into Persian. And I remember wandering around the streets of Tehran in the 70s and seeing some of that stuff on Fridays around the university when the city was a lot smaller, and you could see an awful lot of translated material. And I didn't realize at the time when I was there who Shariati was, but I knew who Fanon was and was amazed to see it easily available there translated. There are some websites here which you can find just by a few Googles, which give some biographical discussion, but also a lot of his translated material, both his essays and some of his books as well. Now, let's consider then the manner in which he talks about clergy-state relations, generally speaking. And I think you can say, without doing a major injustice to the complexities of his entire discourse, that a key element of that discourse generally involves a re-engagement with what he views as the original meaning of Karbala and Imam Hussein's death there in 680. And his understanding that an activist sort of in-their-face interpretation of the meaning and mandates of the faith featured in the discourse of the Imams and dominated the early centuries of the faith. Under the Safavids, however, he argued, the faith lost its activist, oppositional, revolutionary character and took on an accommodationist, pacifist, apolitical, sort of quietist character. In my own words, it supped at the table of the Safavid court. And this legacy so dominated the faith in later years that it was unable to take a leading or really any sort of role in facing down the challenges facing Iran in later years, and especially in his own time. Now, in his Red Shiism, Red Shiism, AlaviShiism, and Black Shiism discussions and paradigm, this is what he was really talking about. And that paradigm is best available in these two particular texts, the Red Shiism versus Black Shiism essay and the longer one on AlaviShiism. English language translations of the first are easily available on Google. Again, I would suggest you check those two sites. I've not checked the translations against any Persian originals, let alone against the volumes of his collected works assembled after the revolution, which, for example, Rahnamah uses quite a lot in his biography. My translation of the text, which runs about 5 pages, is that taken down from the Iran Chamber of Commerce site, which I downloaded in, it's the second of the two websites I downloaded in 2009. It's a very quick read, and it mainly deals with pre-Safavid Shiism. And let me give a really quick synopsis. I'm not going to read the stuff. I'm going to kind of talk at it. And what you want to see is his view that prior to the rise of the Safavids, the Shia were in opposition to mosques and palaces of caliphs and looked at mud houses. And this is the sort of thing that we talked about. That for the period of 8 centuries to the Safavid period, it opposed autocratic, class-conscious regimes of Umayyads and Seljuks and Mongols and everybody. It was well organized, informed, deep, had a well-defined ideology. It led the deprived and oppressed masses in their movements for freedom and such. It caused a great fright. It was deep-rooted and revolutionary, and it caused a great fight in the autocratic rulers and that. Again, second page of this, just grab some of these to kind of capture the flavor of it, talking about the revolutionary cries of Ashura and the aggressive mobilization of the masses. Okay. Prepared all of the oppressed and justice-seeking masses to await participation in the revolt. Privileges the Sarbadars, and in particular, 2 figures of that period. This is the 14th century in the Khorasan area, Sheikh Khalifa and Sheikh Hassan Juri. for their zeal in promulgating a revolutionary form of Shiism. But this was the last revolutionary wave of AlaviShiism, Red Shiism, which continued for 700 years as the flame of the spirit of revolution, freedom-seeking justice towards the people, fighting relentlessly against oppression, ignorance, and poverty. But that was it. And then came the Safavids, and Shiism departed from the great mosque of the masses to become the next door neighbor to the palace of Ali Kapu in the royal mosque in the Maidan in Isfahan. There the essay ends. Lots to unpack here. Whether Sheikh Khalifa and Hassan Juri, both who were associated with, shall we say, the Sardar state in the mid-14th century, were then, let alone now, considered orthodox, Twelver clerics, would get us into a discussion of what is orthodoxy, and I'm going to reprise that discussion a little bit later on, but that's certainly one thing that one could look at. Shariati, of course, wasn't one of the first modern radical, if you will, Islamists to idealize and mourn the passing of a bygone age in Islam. The Ayatollah Khomeini did this. In Egypt, Sayyid Qutb, of course, reformulated the notion of Jahiliyyah, but in the process also addressed when he thought, what was the time period in the history of Islam that he thought that things began to go awry and the faith began to fail to address the kinds of issues that later morphed into his own time into colonialism and imperialism and such. On the subcontinent, of course, al-Maududi did this as well. So there's a lot of this going around in that period, the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that, Al-Ahmad, for example, and others a little bit later on. Anyway, Shariati's brief essay on Red versus Black Shiism talks about Red Shiism, but it doesn't really talk about Black Shiism or Safavid terribly much. And so you really need to talk to that essay, and that's what I'm going to spend a little bit more, but not terribly much more time on. And here it is. Again, it's so far as I can see, and I'm happy to have other dates, it looks to me like 72, 73 is about the time this appeared in the book format. I note here, and I've given the sites, YouTube carries 2 parts of a lecture by him of a total of some 2 hours, which bears this title. I listened to a bit of it, not all of it, and not any bit of part 2. And the sites carry no details as to the provenance, when they were uploaded or when the talks took place or anything like that. And again, I didn't use the collected works edition, which Rouhani tends to cite and use quite a lot. I stuck to the text, both as published and available online, and again, the latter in several different versions. You can find this version. You can also find other versions as well. I also don't know the chronological order of Red Shiism versus this one, though I presume Red Shiism comes first. Here I'm also happy to be corrected. I did not herein spot any references to the earlier version, if that chronology is to be preferred. So that would be one way of testing that, but I didn't see anything in a reasonably good reading. Rouhani gives a reasonable overview of some of the key elements of Shariati's discourse generally on pages 300 to 306, but his citations don't include the citations of any known published edition of this particular text, but only that as it appeared in the collected work. So it's a little different to differentiate where Rouhani is citing this from anything else. It's kind of all in there at the same time. But let's start with an overview, and I'm going to flip through some slides and then come back and talk briefly to what I'm going to be talking about. Roughly speaking, I think the text is possibly divisible into 2 largish sections. After the first some prefatory remarks, then now I lose my own screen, but I assume it's still there. After some prefatory remarks about public speaking and how unaccustomed he is to it, there are what I might be called some stage setting subsections. And I give these in Persian. These are resurgence and order, Ottomans and the West, an attack from behind, Ghabzadagi and Shiism, fear of the mosque, taqlid and mourning, an interesting word for mourning, a change in the direction of Shiism, and another big change, tabdil. He likes this word tabdil. He reprises it from his Islam Shenasi and Jamea Shenasi, this notion of evolution or change. He also likes harakat as movement, and that's what he's contending early Shiism is before it morphs into something else. And then he also uses the word milliyat a reasonable amount too. The second section then talks about some 13 particular subtopics, and he discusses each of these in terms of the 2 Shiisms, AlaviShiism and Safavid Shiism. These he calls the foundations of the two mazhab, the two faiths. There they are: the family of the prophet, infallibility, visayat, velayat, the imamate, justice, taqiyya, sunnah, the sunnah, and bid'ah, intercession, ijtihad, prayer, invocation, and also taqlid. Then he summarizes those in somewhat greater detail, and then he kind of gives a almost poetic couplet sort of form of a snappy way of kind of thinking about these and the juxtaposition of this, which figures in the printed text as well as pretty much all the other editions. So the editors of all these things tried to keep this generally in mind. He has the one here. Sorry, I split to this. I put these in two slides. There's the one juxtaposition and the second. And you notice he ends at the bottom by saying, AlaviShiism is a Shiism of no. Tashayoya Alavi, Tashayoya na, no asked. And Tashayoya Safavid, Tashayoya Ari asked, yes. Accommodationist versus oppositional. So it's pretty clear, what he's trying to say. Now, let me go back very quickly here and very, very quickly reprise these by some of the key points in this section, and then some of the key points in the other section as well. In the early centuries, Shiism was a movement. When it came to the Safavid period, it underwent its tabdil, this change, and it became institutionalized, what he says. He uses this word tabdil quite a lot. So it went from Nazat to Nizam. On the Ottomans, when the Ottomans fell, they opened up the region to the invasion of the West. Initially, the Safavids then and Sheikh Safi ad-Din, his descendants in the period in Ismail, were Qizilbash activists. They reached out to the rural and urban today, the masses. This in contrast to the Shia who had been for too long tied up with the Sunni regimes. Doesn't mention any names here, but such as the Ghaznavids and the Seljuks and everybody. But Qizilbash went into battle screaming death to Omar and Abu Bakr. This was the overt, in-your-face sort of Shiism. It had a massive impact on the Shia Avam, the common people, not like the impact of the Hausa and Elm and all this stuff, which was too remote. So they separated themselves out, these revolutionary Shia, from Sunnism of practice into actually Sunnism of activity. Under the Safavids, you fused religion and Meliyat, that is the faith, and the nation, such that the Safavid Shahs ordered Ashura to be done, but then ordered also Nowruz to be done. So you're having Shiism and Iranism, or Meliyat Irani, fused into the one. But then Shiism was betrayed in a sense, as when the Ottomans and then the Iranians increasingly engaged with Eastern Europe and Christianity, they began to import notions of how mourning was done in Christianity into how this was done on the Iranian scene. And so you ended up with forms of taziyeh that were really adopted from Christianity, and architecture. These kinds of things took on the features of churches. The imams began to be depicted with halos around their heads, very Western. Black banners came in that are associated with Eastern Europe and Christianity. Chest beating and such, that also came from the West as well. The Safavids themselves started building taqiyas and khanagahs, and people then moved away from the mosque into Sufism, and that was the Sufism of the sort of sitting in your corner sort of type, which again was not activist, esoteric, quietist, contemplating and that sort of thing. So for 10 centuries, the Shia ulama had stood kenora mardom, next to the people, with the people. They were free, unlike the Sunnis. They were free socially and economically, these ulama, and they were not attached to the government or other political organizations or institutions. Shiism opposed the existing conditions, but then it changed to one which agreed with them, and the hakim, the shah, the ruler, lived like a caliph and was disobedient to Khuda. Finally, in this period, you had the rise of the Rouhani as opposed to the Alim. And the Rouhani didn't know anything of the faith, its philosophy, Irfan, the history of the faith, Kalam, was over concerned with Furu'a, which took the place of Usul in importance. And these Rouhaniyan didn't even teach the Quran. So Mardomi Shiism, he says, towards the end of this section, becomes Dawlati Shiism. And there was this one, and also AlaviShiism, and they've two been in conflict ever since. In the process, he really only mentions Ismail and Shah Abbas. He mentions the poet Muhtashem Kashani, died in 1588, as finally being able in the early period of the Safavids to write the poetry about Ali that he really wanted. Sheikh Bahai is mentioned, whom I'll mention later, and he's mentioned as a hamkar, an associate or colleague of the court, which is otherwise, the court of Shah Abbas, who was otherwise fasid, who was corrupt. Very briefly on the foundations of the two faiths, you can see them I mentioned what they were before. I really want to talk very briefly about Ghibat and Ijtihad, which I've underlined and boldened here, and then a little bit more about Taqlid, again with the notion of seeing that he's really talking about the present, not really talking so much about the past. The past is being used to talk about the problems of the present. And he's pretty explicit about the present, hence, no doubt, his frequent arrests. On the Ghibat, he talks about the Safavid variant as favoring waiting and patience and quiet and surrender, which he calls negative waiting, okay, bad waiting. Ijtihad, the second one, where the Mujtahid in Alavi Shiism is an independent and free researcher, in Safavid Shiism it's just an empty title. This Mujtahid, and here we go about the present and the past, does not keep up with current developments in society. He doesn't read the newspaper, doesn't listen to the radio, doesn't know any foreign languages, knows no history, does no research, and doesn't get involved in politics. After all, it's the Gheba. So why should we wait and get involved in politics? All we are doing is kind of contemplating, waiting for the Imam to come back. His discussion on Taqlid is rather long, and I want to just grab a few examples of it rather quickly, again, to show that really it's the present he's talking about. In Alavi Shiism, the alim, the researcher, is azad, he's free in his ijtihad. The ammi, the average person, must be in taqlid to him. But in Safavid Shiism, the mardom are in taqlid to a figure because he wears official clothes and he has lots of titles. In Alavi Shiism, taqlid is only to be used in furu', the most narrowest sort of picky, sort of practical kinds of questions. Whereas in Safavid Shiism, everything is open for taqlid. The major things are aqaid, kalam, all the big things are open to Shiism, open to taqlid, and everybody must follow the Rouhani. The discussion then takes a turn. He gives some examples of this in Mashhad, and then he recounts what happened to him a previous year in Medina at the Prophet's Mosque, where a Wahhabi preacher attacked Rafidis and said that they were worse than Jews, and that the Shia held, and here's a reference to Mirza Hassan Nuri, died 1902, that the Quran that we have in front of us is not the real Quran. The Sunnis messed around with it to take out Shi'i kinds of references and such in the Quran. And then he says he's heard locally in Iran, a Safavid preacher, what he calls a Safavid preacher, who was here at the minbar, who said that the Sunnis were worse than the Jews. He said, look, this current Sunni Shi'i war is one between what he calls Umayyad Sunnis and Safavid Shi'is. And it really disregards the Islam kind of war that the faith should be waging with istimar, with colonialism, with imperialism, a worldwide opposition. He later references sectarian killings in Pakistan as well. Real Sunni clerics, he said, and real Shi'i, Roshan fake kinds of clerics don't talk in this way. They know what the true faith is. And therefore, in this instance of the Quran, it's necessary to say to everybody that there was this agreement between the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, Shaltut in 59, and the Shia, that the Jafari Mazhab would become one of the effective Mazhab, and that every good Shi'i marja accepts that the Quran that we have in front of us is the genuine one. So taqlid in matters of belief and etiqadat, that is to say, is haram according to Alavi Shiism, but in Safavid Shiism, it's the norm. And then he ends by saying that the two key components of Safavid Shiism are sultana, authority, and tasawwuf. So you can see he's kind of very anti-Sufism as well. Then you have, again, these nice reprisals here, which again, you can see one by one, easy to keep in mind what the problems are here. The last one is good. Safavid Shiism, Alavi Shiism is the Shiism of Ijtihad versus Jumud. On the next page, you talk about Intizar, the waiting period in which we are now, as being Intizar Mosbat and Intizar Manfi. Just above that, you see that the Safavid or Alavid Shiism is the Shiism of the Imam, the Alid Imamate, whereas Safavid Shiism is the Shiism of the Safavid Sultan or Sultanate authority. And then again, you will end this is very nice no versus yes. Nice juxtaposition here. Now, in the West, and I've worked quite a lot on this, and so there's places you can take a look at in some of my publications. Elsewhere, I've really argued about what the differences are between pre-79 and post-79, the Safavid paradigm. And Western scholarship tends to favor a paradigm of decline, and it tends to favor a great men theory of history. And even across the myriad of subfields that have shown up since 79, you still get an awful lot of this reference, this general paradigm, either explicitly or implicitly. So generally, the Safavids reached their height under Shah Abbas I, who died in 1629, and then he was followed by lesser rulers, so that towards the end, these lesser rulers were brought up in the harem. They became prisoners of the court and the palace eunuchs and the clerics, and Majlisi is one of these clerics. And they basically, the last Safavid Shah, Sultan Hussein, was depicted as so attentive to the goodwill of courtiers and clerics, including Majlisi, that the society could not mount an effective response to internal and external crises. One of these was an Afghan attack that resulted in the capture of Isfahan in 1722. The reference to Majlisi brings us right back to what we're talking about here, this notion of clergy sort of state relations. This depiction of the Safavids really starts with Edward Brown in the 20s, up to Lawrence Lockhart in his 1958 work, and was reprised just before the revolution by Roger Savory, Iran under the Safavids. So what are the agendas here? And very quickly, I'll try to do this and then move on to something of a further discussion. So Shariati sees the faith as revolutionary and oppositional, representing and galvanizing the Mardom, the today, to actively challenge the status quo. They decried the clerics of the period for having cozied up to the state. They went soft. They compromised the faith's basic oppositional principles, so its scholars were unable to mount any credible challenges to the ills that face Iran today. Didn't talk much about Afghans or anything like that. He's really talking about today. And then to the end, at the end of the second text, Safavidchism is yes, AlaviShiism is no. So far as I can see, these positions are about as opposite to each other as opposite can be. 180 degrees completely different between Shariati and the Western discussion, generally speaking, of the Safavid period. The clergy supped at the table of the Safavid court, or they captured it, okay, and so crippled the state that it couldn't respond to internal and especially external challenges. At work in each case is an agenda, and I would suggest that the arguments tell us as much, if not more, about the agendas here as about any ostensible information that we're talking about in the period, in this case, about Safavid Iran and what was going on in Shiism in Safavid Iran. Easier to talk about agendas and their role and influence in the case of a single individual. So Shariati's agenda, I think, is pretty clear. He's looking around, even in this one discourse, not to say anyplace else, and even a cursory reference to his overall agenda suggests he's looking for an explanation as to why the faith has lost its way. Well, how come we aren't, here it is, it's our own. It's nothing else, it's not Marxist or Western or anything. It's not an import, it's our own, it's been our own for so long. Why isn't it standing up and becoming the focal point for the population to oppose colonialism? He's not alone, of course, in Iran at this time. There's Ahmad and Khomeini himself. And of course, post-Boroujerdi, who died in 1961, there were these debates about the marja'iyat and such that Akhavi talks about in his 1980 book. For the first time, so far as I know, almost 20 years later, Akhavi comes around and says, oh, by the way, there were these debates. Nobody else was writing about Iran at the time, paid any attention to them. Grappling with how we could make the faith more relevant. And again, as I've suggested, say, Qutb and elsewhere, and Maududi are looking at these same kinds of things, trying to revitalize the faith as an indigenous sort of thing. We've already got it to hand. We just need to kind of turn it around here, and it will suffice for the population to rally against these foreign influences. Western scholarship maintains that the period to 1501 was one in which political quietism and a focus on esotericism were the rule in Twelver Shiism. The Safavid period, so goes the narrative, witnessed the clerics taking a completely different turn, turning political and capturing the state and speeding it on its inevitable path to the events of 1722 and the fall of Isfahan. Majlisi dominates the discourse. In fact, he's the preeminent example of the faith gone political, both in the pre-79 and the post-79 scholarship. So I have a fancy slide here kind of to illustrate a little bit in your face what these paradigms are. And if I can get it to work, there you go. Okay, so pre-79, Shah Abbas equals the Shah. Both were great modernizers, had lots of contacts with the West, were positive, were clamping down on unruly sorts of things like religion or tribes or things that worked against the centralization and progress and arts and society and such like. The lesson here from the Safavid period is their beware, don't let religion get out of hand, because we know what happens from history when religion in Iran gets out of hand. You end up with the decline of the Safavid state. So therefore, the Shah is trying to get religion under control, and therefore this is a good model. Of course, according to great man theory, when the great man dies, all heck breaks loose. And true to form, as suggested above, it did. Both the last Shah and his father tried to crack down on the power of the Alterumma, but then you have this other slide. Let's see if it works. Bingo. Post 1979, you've reprised this. And you have this picture from Majlisi, and you have the Ayatollah Khomeini not smiling. I did a thing one time, I'll digress if you permit, Oliver, to note in Mashhad that I said, I gave a talk, and I said, you know, pictures of Khomeini in the West, he's always scowling. He's always scowling and angry. And immediately I started getting all these emails of pictures of Khomeini smiling. I said, well, we get him smiling too. So I thought this was quite good. I've discussed this a bit in this particular article here. In post-79 Safavid and Shi'i studies, these fields resisted the very brief moment of the field's introspection, Middle Eastern studies introspection of the Islamic period of the revolution of 79. How come we didn't see it coming? And in fact, these fields, Safavids and Shi'ism, doubled down on the previous paradigm, basically to say, well, you see what happened was, this proves the point. Shi'ism got out of the box, the faith got out of the box. In fact, the argument goes, although it's never said, history's repeated itself. Majlisi brought down the Safavids, Khomeini brought down the modernizing of the Shah. Again, I published a little bit on this. No need to go into that in any more detail. Now, what's this got to do with clerics and the state in the Safavid period and now? I'm going to bring this up. There, it works perfectly. Okay. On one side, Willem Fleur reminds us that in the 17th century in Iran, most people didn't live in the cities. He estimates that 85 to 90% of the population, never more than 9 million, was rural. Okay. That means, and again, I take this language map from 64 to suggest that in my day, when I was there in Iran, I had people argue to me that Turkish languages were actually the real first language of Iran. But look at this language map in 64, and then extrapolate it back, if you will, to the 17th century, and it can only have been more so. So in terms of languages, let alone literacy and such, then really you have to remind yourself that the extent of what is not known about the Safavid social and cultural life far outweighs what is known. Mainly because the domestic and foreign sources thereon, which historians rely so much for discussion of Safavid socioeconomic and political and cultural life, are very few in number, and they're urban-based, mainly around Isfahan, and of course subject to their own biases, most of the latter of which are never explored. So in the face of a map like this pushed back to the 17th century, we're mostly looking at Isfahan, we're mostly looking at Persian, when in fact we're missing the boat. So I would suggest what we need to do is turn the socio-intellectual pyramid on its head. Turn the pyramid on its head, the socio-intellectual pyramid on its head, to begin to understand what the heck is going on with the 85 to 90% of the population, not to mention focusing on plenty fewer great men, both in terms of the Shahs themselves, but also the very few Safavid clerics on whose works we kind of rely to tell us what was going on in terms of the spiritual life of society at the time. And an opportunity to do this is doing something called subaltern studies. Subaltern studies is referring to the importance of subordinate groups in the making of history, usually defined as encompassing the rural and urban underclasses, always the majority in society. Generally non-elites, including women. Often the discourse concentrates or turns on instances of social protest as points whereat subalterns make their voices heard, both in response to or sometimes independent of manipulations by the elite. It's associated with Antonio Gramsci. It's associated with the History from Below movement here in this country, Edward Thompson, Christopher Hill, and it first appears by name in subcontinent studies with the works of Renajit Goha. Now, subaltern studies and Middle Eastern studies are not strangers. There's plenty of stuff in Middle Eastern studies on this, but there's also material in Iranian studies. And one of the first of these was Ervan Abrahamyan's Crowd in Iranian Politics from '68. And then you have the works of Stephanie Cronin, including her most recent work, Social History of Iran, Modernism and Marginality from 2021. And in fact, there is Safavid subaltern studies, even if we don't necessarily call it that when we talk about it. Our second keynote speaker is the author of one of these, The Peasant Uprisings in Astrabad. There's material coming out about Pizzlebosh rituals and practices. This is one of the more recent ones. In terms of religion, in particular Sufism, you have Atta Anzali's work on the Zahabiyya. Lloyd Ridgeon is going to be joining us for a talk, and he did this discussion of the Kalantars in late Safavid Iran. And then I kind of offered a reprise of some of the things I've been doing this in his edited Routledge handbook on Sufism. And from that, I'm going to flip to some points about the anti-clericism of 17th century, and here's my second go at pronouncing this word with no more coffee, antinomianism. There we go. Right. And just to cut to the chase, in this discourse, you can see that Ilm is rejected as the sole preserver of the ulama, so is hell. They believed in the transmigration of souls. Abu Muslim, who long debate on Abu Muslim as a friend of Ahlul Bayt, they rejected going to mosque. They rejected prayer, no Hajj, no zakat, into monasticism, had food diets, food regulations, and also dress. They believed in personal, direct, unmediated connection with the divine. That is, you didn't need the ulama at all. You could do this yourself or in an order led by a peer or individually, and physical activities to generate that kind of feeling, singing, dancing, drinking wine, and such. It's not to be forgotten that even what we know about Isfahan in the 17th century tells us that Isfahan was a pretty unruly place. And two popular figures who scholars of the period know, Sheikh Bahai and Faisal Kashani, were both turfed from their their court-appointed posts by popular protests. So there was a lot. Isfahan was really a hotbed of activity. And my own postulation is this particular period in the 17th century, this antinomian, very heterodox, very anti-clerical discourse, even in the urban areas, but certainly probably in the rural areas as well, was probably the norm, that is, in the majority. And what we conceive of as being orthodox, based on our recourse to the written texts, was probably in the minority. And again, I've written about this, summarized it in the article in Lloyd's book. Just about done. So again, in conclusion on the Safavid period, I would suggest, in fact, that it was not really till the 18th century that the faith developed, if you will, legs in the more peripheral areas in Iran, including the more rural areas, not to say some tribal areas as well. That is the faith, what we consider of as being something closer to Orthodox. So let me offer a very quick summary, and then I'll bow out. I've tried to argue about the importance of the Safavid period, why it was important at the beginning of modern Iran, and for Twelver Shiism when it finally found a home. As such, there it is a battleground for interpretation, much as if you're an American, the legacy of the founding fathers is what the founding fathers really intended in setting up the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, what they really meant by this. The Safavid period is that sense for modern Iran. And so arguments about the present play out when you deal with the past, both in Iran and abroad. And I've given a couple examples of the Shariati and the Western Academy. The two are diametrically opposed. Yeah, you can't miss it. In fact, however, if we could consider then history as polemic, then we need to stand back for a second and realize that we know less than we think we know. And I would suggest this is the case both in the past and possibly also in the present. And therefore, a thing to do to try and get in touch with the massive public opinion, as it were, is to knowingly invert the socio-intellectual period, turn it upside down, and then begin to look at how authority is viewed at that level. And I would suggest that the notion that Sheikh Bahai or Mir Damad or Ali Shariati or Tusi or the Hillis, the idea that when they said jump, people said, right, how high, is highly problematic. First of all, you have to assume that they heard about it, especially in some peripheral areas, that they understood what was meant by that, and that they knowingly decided to do that. And certainly in the past as well as the present, you see people actively headed the other way. Either they thought it out in a great deal, or just this is their interpretation of the way to do this, and they just head out in their own direction. I would suggest you see that in the West, in Christianity, certainly and the East as well, but I would suggest it is more the norm than the exception. So on the ground, the actual impact of elites of whatever persuasion and their claims to authority are just claims. And it should not necessarily be confused with actually people doing, as it were, what they've been told. And thank you very much.
Andrew, for this very engaging and clear and accessible presentation. And again, as I said in the beginning, I'm extremely pleased that sort of you brought these different threads that will certainly shape the papers throughout the conference together. Sort of pre-modern clergy-state relations, taking the Safavids as example, the kind of the reception history and the memory of this, and the kind of utilization of particular sort of historical memories for more modern political purposes, framing it more generally in terms of how academic scholarship has sort of approached Safavid history, and how these approaches are shaped by political agendas. I think your last remarks, and hopefully we'll have the chance to pick the discussion up on notions of orthodoxy and heterodoxy, and how useful they actually are in designating different strands of Shi religiosity. I think that's quite a pertinent point. So I'd like to ask Douglas to sort of stop the recording now, if he could, and then to open the floor for questions and comments.